Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making time to be here for the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future State and Municipal Statutory Plan Process Working Group. Before we start today's meeting, I would like to just ask us all to take a moment to recognize and honor Sergeant Dustin DeMonte and Officer Alex Hansey, and to also keep in our prayers Officer Alec Mayorado, who has been injured, and all of their families and members of the Bristol Police Department and others around our state. So if we could just take a moment of silence. Thank you. As we start today, I want to just thank again all of you who have been participating in this. We are, as we talked about before, going to increase our off tempo a little bit as we get towards the initial report. And the first item on our agenda today is actually to talk about timeline. And I'm just going to call on Ashley Foreman for just a moment to remind us of the requirements.
Absolutely. So the final report will be due January of 2024. We are asking for the recommendations from all working groups a week before the December 5th meeting. So I will be sending out an email a little bit before then, just making sure we have those recommendations just for any of the legislative things so that we can get them in before the start of session in January.
Great, thank you, Ashley. December 5th will be here much more quickly than we know. And I know we're not quite at the drafting point yet. So I want to just thank Rebecca Auger and Eric and the OPM team. Rebecca has been helpful in moving us forward in terms of how we have this conversation and put together the pieces of the things we've been talking about as a group, and hopefully we'll be talking about today. Before we kind of jump into the homework questions, so to speak, and I will turn it over at that point to Rebecca, but any comments or questions about the timeline that we're facing? John?
Just maybe I misheard you, Ashley, through you, Representative McCarthy-Vahey. It is January 23, not January 24. Am I correct?
The final report is January 2024. Okay. But we are asking for the recommendations from the working groups by this December so that we can incorporate any legislation into the upcoming session.
Gotcha. All right. Just wanted to clarify and make sure I didn't mishear.
And John, I thank you for clarifying that. And there are a couple reasons. One, in the legislation, excuse me, this year, we did extend the timeline for the working groups. So because we found that the conversations have been pretty robust. However, specifically when it comes to the State Plan of Conservation and Development, because of the pre-work needed, and when we pass the plan, the corresponding extension with the state plan, there are going to need to be steps taken before we get to that final report. So in particular, this group and some of the suggestions that we have before the next legislative session are really important timing-wise. Any other comments or questions about that? No? Okay. With that, we're going to go on to item number 2 on the agenda, the discussion of the homework questions. And for members of the public who might be listening in, the group had a series of things to reflect upon look at as we look at moving forward. And particularly, we'll go through that, but just essentially whom and what should guide the state plan of conservation and development, and how that works currently, who should take part in guiding and adopting the plan, what role should data and mapping play in the plan, should there be measurable objectives, how important is consistency among levels of government. We've talked about that a lot at this group, as we've heard from both municipal, COG, and state leaders. And then how should the plan be implemented? So those are kind of the scope of questions. And I'm going to go ahead and actually turn it over to you, Rebecca, to have you lead us through this conversation. And I just will say, it's been great to work together as it has been in the past with Eric and now Rebecca, to have the help of our planners as we talk about the plan. So the people who are the pros. So Rebecca.
All right, thank you. So I don't know if you don't feel like I need to bring the questions up on the screen. I kind of prefer to be able to see you when we're in discussion. So if you're okay with that, we'll just leave them off, the representative to just go through them one by one. But I think hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at them and reflect on them yourselves. And I'd like to just kick us right off into tackling the first one on what your thoughts are, especially after you've heard from various levels of government. And then OPM has also engaged other state agencies kind of in this discussion as well in the past few weeks of, whom and what should the state C&D plan guide? Because really, according to the legislation now, it guides state actions. And it's supposed to guide the executive branch on land and water resource conservation and development, and a series of topical issues that have been added over the years. But if we take a step back from that legislative requirements, what do you all think about what the state C&D plan should be guiding and who it should be directed at?
So
Sure.
I will ask actually Rebecca, either if you want to, I'm happy to moderate. One thing I will say, it always helps if people are able to use that raise hand function in the Zoom, which I know can be a pain. It just keeps it for everyone. Although Chip, I saw you put your hand up. Rebecca, do you want to take answers, or would you like me to moderate that?
I can do it if you'd like. I have no preference.
All right, I'm gonna leave that to you. Just
Okay.
that reminder for people if you can.
Okay, so I did see Chip's hand up. Go ahead, Chip.
All right. I think it would be very important that this turns into a strategic planning document where everybody is on the same page. And I've talked about sidewalks a bunch of times, but I think it's an obvious example of the public wanting something that is not really addressed to either merge sidewalks between towns when they would be appropriate, nor does DOT seem like it's a priority when they repave or do things. And I think if we talk about complete streets and half the people not being able to use automobiles, drive themselves, then I think we need to do that, at least in our populated areas. And I don't see, we've got that in the POCD, but it doesn't really function and make anything happen over the 20 years I've done in government to the extent I think that it should have done. I think there's a laundry list of things that could be done like that, but I think there's got to be a lot more teeth in the funding goes to those strategic priorities. And you probably can't do everything, but if we picked on one thing for 15 or 20 years, we'd be done and move on to the next one.
Okay, so I'm hearing it really should direct state funding according to a prioritized strategic plan.
Right.
Okay. SN, I think I saw your hand up first.
May I, Rebecca?
Yes.
I apologize for doing this, but I'm reminded of the remote meetings bill. We did not do introductions at the beginning today. If everyone could at least, when you first speak, say who you are, and just a reminder about that with our remote meeting protocols. Thank you.
So Chip,
Chip Hackett from Glastonbury.
Thank you. Okay, and now SM?
My name is Savannah Nicole Vielba, and I'm a planner in Connecticut. And so my thought on whom should guide the plan, it's going to kind of be a related theme throughout all my homework answers, is that if it only is for state agencies, but if we could find a way to even just include COGS or that regional level as to who it's guiding, I think that could be really beneficial. One thing that it's not unique to Connecticut, but does make Connecticut unique is that local control of planning. So if the state plan does have some stronger requirement for the regional plans, it's the regional plans of conservation and development that can take those policies and show what they would look like in implementation on the local level. And so I think that could kind of get at Chip's point where maybe the regional plan is that intermediary that shows the map of where all the interconnected sidewalks should be. And yeah, that's where I'll stop.
Okay, so the state plan would ultimately set the policy objectives for COGS, which would get a little more into how those objectives will be met. Okay, great. Lynn?
Hi, I'm Lynn Haig from the city of Bridgeport. Savannah stated a lot of what I was going to say. And I was also taken by the sentence. It said state agencies in certain actions and in their own planning. That's what the state plan will be guiding. Well, how many other actions do those state departments undertake that don't fall under this? I see this plan as very high level and being the guiding document for how the ship, AKA all state departments, should function and what they should do. And it is high level. The local POCD is in the weeds level. And then that, like Savannah said, that the COGS would be in between. So I know I'm sort of talking ahead to some of the other questions that we were pondering, but I really see this as being, it should be much more comprehensive and really drive the actions that all the state departments take. At least that's how I perceive it should act. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Rachel, I think I saw your hand next.
Hi, so Rachel DeSenza, New Canaan, Connecticut. And so my perspective may be a little bit different. So I always kind of come in from that corporate business perspective, not in the state world. So for me, I think that at the state level, the state should have kind of that framework and the mechanics of how it should be run and maybe set a process. I think they should have kind of that high level budget management piece of it for obviously the budget that they're going to provide, if they're going to provide any. But I think as far as any, like I look at it as from like a corporate goal perspective, if the goal is grow the business by 10%, the specifics are pushed down. So they would not be driving the details and policies. That would all be down. They're providing the framework because they don't know what goes on down below. So it's very high level. They, might give general where they want to go, the vision, right? Grow the business, grow X area by 10%, grow this, but in no way, shape, or form would it say how to get there. Again, I think we talk later about the additional levels, and I'll wait on that once we get to those additional levels on how I see each level kind of working it out, similar how in a corporation it would go through, and then how it goes down and then back up again, so that you can hold them to it. So I'll wait on the other areas.
Okay, great. So I'm hearing maybe more of a visionary sort of document.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Kevin?
Hi, Kevin Alvarez, Deputy Chief of Staff to the Mayor of New Haven. So I saw it as, and this will cover certain other areas, but that the plan should, in a similar way to what Rachel just said, it should set a broader vision of essentially an assessment of here are our needs and here are our assets in our current land use and our current sort of development, and these are what our major needs are. And then I think it was a good point that SN had talked about where the COGS would play a role, or at least in my visioning, the COGS would play a role of over a 5-year period of when you have to renew these plans, be responsible for overseeing the sort of responsibilities that each of the municipalities have towards achieving those goals. Because I think the plan should set out, all right, we have X amount of housing, we have X amount of sidewalk coverage in these high traffic areas, what have you, and then set and identify where there are significant deficits currently. And then the COG level would be responsible for generally steering, okay, in our region, we have, these are our objectives that we have to get to over these 5 years. These are the metrics that are set out in this plan. And now it's on the local level for us to work to get there. But so that there's a clear, here's what we need, here's what it is your responsibility to actually be doing, so that it is clear at the local level that we can't just ignore what's going on in the state plan. I think folks were right before in that it does direct state agencies and their actions, but it should also at the local level drive the responsibility of those municipalities to meeting it, because they have such a significant tool in their ability to control land use.
Okay. Thank you. John Ford.
Hey, Rebecca, John, New Britain. Let me actually just quickly lower my hand. I want to sort of echo a little bit of what SN was saying, as well as Chip. I think we do need a strategic plan angle to this, as well as ensuring that we keep the, let's be honest, 3 major forms of government here: state guidance giving that 50,000 view, the COG level plan giving a little more detail, and then really retaining a lot of control at the local level. I also do agree that I think it does need to be a whole of government approach, including agencies that we may not necessarily think have a traditional POCD approach. And the last thing that I'll mention is specifically, I think, with those regional workshops and the COGS, I think if there's ways to form stronger relations and try to get out into the communities more, I think that's something that we can try to hopefully try to improve on as well, and stress more as well.
Okay, thank you. And we'll get into a little bit more of who should be involved in developing the plan in a moment. Maureen.
Hi, Maureen Goulet, Capital Region Council of Governments. Just wanted to chime in that the COGS are already doing some of these things. We do have a regional plan of conservation and development, and we work with our towns to update that every 5 years. Some of the additional things that have been added in, such as regional natural hazards, those are regional plans that we work on at the COG level as well. But I do think that the general tenor of these comments is something that we would agree with at the COG level, that the state needs to have that vision of what sort of the idea is and how it's going to work. And then it'll come down and filter down each level. So the plans are meeting the needs of the region and the local town as well.
Okay, thank you. Charles?
Sure, Charlie Gardner, Newtown. Actually, a lot of what I was going to say it's already been mentioned by people, but again, going back to the COG issue for Newtown, for example, West COG released it's a 143-page conservation development plan just a couple of years ago, which is intended to cover the whole decade of the 2020s. And it's a very high level document, really taking a bird's eye approach. So I guess given that, and given that each of the towns is on its own schedule as to its plan of conservation development, I think Newtown hasn't updated theirs since 2014. Generally wondering about the time frame and the sequence and how each of these documents influences the next one, given that you seem to be on something of a staggered timeframe with states, localities, and the COGS.
All right. Anyone else on thoughts about whom and what should the state C&D plan guide? If not, we'll move on to the next question, which was who should take part in developing and adopting the C&D plan. As you know now, it's a creature of the legislature. The continuing legislative committee is responsible for putting it together and recommending it to the General Assembly for adoption. OPM heads the drafting of it, and the current process has typically been to work with state agencies, work with COGS and municipalities through the drafting phase. But really, OPM has traditionally seen itself as staff to the continuing committee on the development and taking its lead from the continuing committee. So, SN, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so I want to reiterate John B's point that I'd like to see more involvement in outreach. And again, this is following with my idea of this, the state plan connecting more to the regional plan in some sort of manner. I went just anecdotally to the planning conference for Southern New England recently, and Rhode Island has a state planning division. And I know that OPM kind of plays that role in the state of Connecticut. I think I don't know, but it would be really great, I think, in the state of Connecticut for that to be clearer, not only to COGS, but to municipalities and to constituents of these areas. So if we can find ways to make it clear how OPM connects to these, that's great for the COGS, that's great for the state, and that's great for the people who live here. So, and I acknowledge that resources, so time, location, staff capacity are all issues, but I think this is the place to dream.
Okay, thank you. Chip?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I would have the COGS assemble what their goals are and aspirations and have OPM put it all together for a statewide plan to merge them. And then I would have the legislature probably ratify it for like a 20-year time frame and let OPM update it every 5 years. Legislature could certainly weigh in, but I think they've shown that other things get in front of this. And I think the state administratively and the towns and COGS aren't able to work when the legislature isn't able to approve the plan on time.
Okay. Maureen?
So I just have a comment on who should take part and in the public comments. I think the way the state does public comments is really detrimental to getting good input. I think the state needs to be more proactive into getting into the communities where they're soliciting input, meeting the people where they are instead of asking the people to come to them.
Okay. Thank you. John Board? Oh, you're muted, John.
Thanks, Rebecca. Twofold. One, I completely agree with Maureen. I think, state, to some degree, more so the state than the COGS going to the municipalities, I think is critical. And second, to sort of respond to Chip's idea of the state, setting the 20-year plan. What about this idea, Chip, of having that 20-year plan, but it reverting back to the COGS every 5 years for review? So then where at least the municipalities get input, and it's not a whole rewrite every so often. I'm not sure if that's maybe a middle ground that we can, say, and we can play around with if it's 5 years, 10 years, whatnot, but something along those lines.
Chip, I'll get to you in a moment. Lynn had her hand up.
I'm confused because on the last question, it sounded like this plan is for the state agencies. It's supposed to guide the state agencies, but then the statement was made here that, well, this is really a plan for the legislature. So whose plan is it? And I think that's a question that we've been asking all along. And on the first question, I would have answered, well, this is a plan ratified by the legislature, but it's created by the executive branch for use of the executive branch with input from from the legislative branch, obviously. But so looking at it from that perspective, if I'm defining it that way, then yes, there would be input from the residents of Connecticut, the municipalities, but I think that should be a lower priority. It should be the higher priority of input. If this plan is to be a guiding document for the departments, it should be a lot more focused on the departments and the legislature than it should be on the local municipalities. The COGS also play a high role in that, but because I think they would also represent the local voice as well. So it really depends on how we really answer that question, which I still don't think we've answered, as to whose plan is this.
Yeah, and I think we're hearing different concepts here. Chip, you had your hand up.
I did, only to respond to John that I think we should have a long-term strategic plan vision that's coordinated between the COGS, because they do so much federal funding in the state. And then it should be updated every 5 years, but I think it should be an administrative update rather than a legislative update. And Lynn, I agree with you. I think that it should drive the state, and it should drive the state's funding to say these are our priorities. And if a town wants to do something that's not in the priority list, have at it, town, no problem, but you're not getting any state money for it.
Okay, Rachel?
So I may just be confused. I'll start there, but so I'm trying to really grasp is, like, I'm understanding the plan, right, to be a strategic plan, goals, right? And so if that's the case, then for me, it would be top down, right? What are the state's goals for conservation and development? Where do we want to go? What do we want done? What do we see? And it's pushing it down, top down, and then bottom up, say, how are you going to get there? And so it would really be that looking across, the various constituents at the top to say, what do we need to accomplish as a state, reaching out to all the experts, but really, again, it's more of that kind of top down from a goals and a strategic planning, whether it be reaching out to, OPM and all the various, experts that they work with at the state level. But to me, that's where that strategic plan, that those goals start. Again, very high level goals. Where I'm struggling is as I look through these documents, this regulatory concept keeps coming in to play. The state driving really, really detailed regulatory details on how those high level strategic goals need to be accomplished and what needs to be done. And there's this conflict. And so that's where I continue to struggle. Like, again, for me, this exercise, this plan, this strategic goal is all about, they've got funding, they've got what they want done, it ties together, and then it goes out, and how are you going to accomplish it? And again, it's the 3 levels, pushing it down. It's almost like, for me, again, it's like the executive, the ELT, your department, and your individual contributor, right? In a corporate setting. And then you come back up, and if you hit it, you get your bonus at the end of the year. There's the teeth in the end of it. But again, there's this other concept that keeps coming in of, but then you've got, your executive team saying, but you need to do it this way. And it's all that regulatory piece that keeps coming back into this plan. And that's, I think, the part that I'm struggling with. So which one is it? Is it a strategic document and is it goals? Or is it you're going to do it this way? And really there isn't anything that's, it's top down and you're being told how to do it. And I don't think that is the way it should be done. I think it's more of that, here's as a state, these are our priorities and help us get there. Anyway, okay, I'll shut up.
Okay. No, thank you. Representative McCarthy-Vahey.
Thanks. That's the hard part about giving up the gavel, because you can't jump in. I'm going to try and do more listening today than talking, but just kind of in response to some of the things that Lynn said, whose plan in it? Lynn, you maybe have been a fly on the wall, perhaps, when Martin Heft and I have had this conversation, where Martin continually reminds me that it is the plan of the continuing committee of the legislature, but the executive branch is who implements the plan. And that's where, wearing my legislative hat, to the conversation of having the, state agencies provide input. This plan in the past has taken input from people all over the state, where, to Maureen, your point, we probably do need to get more creative about how we're getting that input in the modern day. I will give kudos to Fairfield. They've reached out with some electronic opportunities for people to do that. But in the past, those meetings have been held around the state. Very few people have come to the meetings. But I think the struggle has been, over the years, the legislature, going way back, was way more involved in some of those specific changes. And then when it became more of a broader goal, Rachel, kind of what you're talking about, the strategic document, the legislature was a little less engaged with those day-to-day pieces. And I think, when we're talking about adopting a 20-year plan, that concerns me, because that's a really broad time horizon. And then with the caveat of perhaps we update it every 5 years, whether it's COGS or administratively, I will react, not for myself as much as I could hear some of my fellow legislators saying, whoa, we're not necessarily ready to turn that over in that way, right? Yet, the reality is OPM is working with agencies to do the implementation. So whose plan is it? It's the state's plan, but who is the state in this case, right? Is the state OPM? Is the state the legislature? Is the state the governor's office? Is the state, working through the COGS? I think that's part of exactly what we're trying to get at. And no, we haven't answered the question. That's true, in terms of going forward. And I just want to make one other comment to Rachel, what you were saying about the regulatory aspect. I think that's really difficult based on what I've learned of all the other plans that are required, for example, by the state, by the federal government. And I think that plays into what happens in the state plan of conservation and development, because there are very much prescriptive things that need to be considered. So if in fact, for example, we end up looking at a broader state plan that is a stronger umbrella to those other plans, so to speak, we will continue to run into that tension for certain.
Totally. I guess my question is, and I looked at some of the regs, my background's a compliance officer, so I did look at some of the regs, and I feel like some of it is driven by what you have to do versus how to do it, right? So there's a requirement and then there's how to get there. And I find that some of what I'm seeing come down is the how to get there versus just meeting a requirement. And so again, so let's use, 830G. It's need to gain 10%. right? So, but how prescriptive is that requirement? And I think that's really where some of the things pushing down how you get there, right, can be different. Anyway, we don't need to get into it here, but I think that's really what I'm talking about. So the goal at the top, right, is increase affordable housing by 10%. That is the goal. That's the strategic plan. But the state should not be at the state level, right? Level one should not be dictating, and then they have the budget, right? But should not be dictating each and every at a municipality level how that plays out. I guess that's kind of what I'm talking about. It should go back up to say, we will do it by this. Anyway, that's my point.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think we all just, the reality is the legislature will pass laws that will impact all of these plans.
Mhm.
So whatever we recommend or decide, or even the continuing committee does in the state plan, there very well may be the pieces of legislation that are outside of the plan. That's exactly my point. So there are pieces of federal legislation that are outside of the plan.
Yeah.
And state legislation as well. So, and then, there's that tension between what is and what should be. And I definitely don't want to go down the 830G rabbit hole right now. I think it's a worthy discussion, but I think that's part of the tension that we as a group face as we're looking at developing recommendations for process and scope, is that the legislature will have a voice, whether we would want them to or not. But we do want them to, because that's also how people in our towns and our municipalities have a voice, because their representatives are representing them. So it's a real tension. I think it's a valid conversation that is being raised here.
Okay.
Thank you.
John Guskowski.
Hi, for the record, John Guskowski. I'm with the Connecticut chapter of the American Planning Association. I just wanted to, I think, echo Lynn's thoughts on this, that I think this does need to be a stronger, and maybe I'm putting words in her mouth, but it needs to be a stronger state plan, which is to say, I believe, an executive branch plan. I think the participation and ultimate sort of blessing and approval of the legislature is an important component, but I think it maybe needs to evolve legislatively in more of a direction that it is an executive branch plan. It's a 5-year plan, which is roughly the length of an executive branch term, and is meant to set vision for the state, which in is an executive function, not necessarily a legislative function. And it needs to have that stronger hammer to it. And I think, as Stuart said, when municipalities aren't necessarily interested in advancing, this goal or that goal, have at it, but you're on your own financially. That the state, as through its executive branch, through its distribution of funds, through its investments, should reflect the goal of this plan, and all of that is in the realm of the executive branch. And I'm fighting COVID here, so I'll shut up.
Thanks, John. John Board.
John, hope you are feeling at least a little better or getting a little better day by day. I wanted to go back to what Rachel and Lynn was saying. I think that you're right. I think both of you are right, that this seems to be a battle between, are we doing top down or bottom up approach? And I would also say, I think maybe this might be a question for Representative McCarthy-Vahey. Have we ever defined in statute, and maybe this is one of the legislative recommendations we make, is clearly defining in statute whose plan this is, because I think that goes to the core of, I think, some of the troubles that we've had over time. So maybe that might just be a casual recommendation that we try to move forward.
Okay, and I'll just say that the statutes suggests that really this is a plan to guide state agencies. It is adopted through the General Assembly. And it doesn't really speak to anything beyond advisory to COGS and municipalities.
From your perspective, Rebecca, do you think from an OPM perspective, do you think it would be helpful to clarify that language? Because obviously there is still some, if we're having questions around discrepancy, I assume others do. Do you think it would be helpful for the legislature to try to provide some more guidance?
I think if this group reaches some consensus on whose plan it is and who it should be guiding, and it's different from what the statutes say, then yes, but I think there's actually quite a bit of room to work within the statutes that exist now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Kevin?
Yeah, so I think to some extent, the conversation we're having is kind of strange because it's the state plan, the executive branch and the legislative branch are both the state, and it's a symbiotic relationship. It's the executive branch evaluates essentially, here are the needs based off of what our sort of strategic goals are in the state. We have access to the staff and factual information about what is going on in the state. We present that and what our recommendations to the legislative branch are. And then the legislative branch, which is the democratic body representing everybody in the state, then says yes or no, or I think that should change. And then it goes back to the executive branch of, okay, now the legislature has told us that this is what we need to implement. So I don't think I don't think there's the necessary tension that we seem to be describing, but I do think that it should both inform the executive branch and the actions that they take, but it should also, the local plans of conservation and development and regional plans of conservation and development should be by law aligned with what the state's plan is. Because if the legislature is, or the executive branch is not taking the power that it has over land use, which when we're talking about conservation and development, I don't know how a discussion of land use isn't a fundamental component of that. If localities are not aligned with what that state plan is, as they very much are not now. Like there are vast needs of the state that local governments are not creating policies that achieve those goals. It's not going to do anything. Like if we're going to have another plan that's going to direct state agencies in some of the decisions they make around some funding that they give out, fine, but it's not going to ever actually get us towards achieving those goals. So I think it's important that the state, like part of the recommendations that are created in this are what things need to happen. It's not necessarily ascribing who needs to do them, but that they need to happen. And then it's up to the legislature to decide which actions they're going to take or not take. But it should be requiring, when it's passed by the legislature, that local governments are actually passing policies that align with these goals, because if they're not, then what's the point of having the plan in the first place?
Sorry. Thank you, John. Kevin, go ahead, SM.
So I think when I found out that I got onto this group, I was excited because I was thinking I was a regional municipal planner at the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments. I was helping municipalities with their municipal plans of conservation and development. And I think, at least my perception of the beginning conversations we had, I think a lot of us wanted to talk about the municipal plans of conservation and development or the regional plans. And it took me a little bit to realize, like, oh, that's related, but isn't necessarily the scope of what we're trying to do here. And maybe a recommendation is that the state plan does require some changes or things that we come up with, but a recommendation is that the regional and state or regional municipal statute around plans of conservation and development get looked at, because we're all highlighting things that work really well or things that aren't working really well that I think do deserve a place to be heard or studied further. But I want to just touch base really quickly on what John and Lynn are saying. And it's one of those moments where until you hear it, you're like, oh, that really does make sense. And when we think about the time span of the regional and municipal plans of conservation and development, they're 10 years. The statute in them is very clear, and I don't want to call it a laundry list, but there's a ton of things that each of those plans are supposed to touch on. It's the same thing on the state level, but they're different types of goals that need to be talked about. And so hearing it's an executive plan, yeah, it makes sense to me why it's every 5 years. Hearing Lynn and John, I'm like, okay, I'm following that line of reasoning. But I really want to advise against putting the municipal and the regional plans on a 5-year time span, because for those of us who've worked on plans of conservation and development, they take time. They're very, like, if you want a good plan, it's a while to plan that. It's a while to do community engagement. It takes a lot of time to draft. They're gonna go. I would be very scared that they would decrease in quality. They would decrease in the amount of engagement we get in them. And then what? You have 4 or 3 years to get through all your goals. You're just going to keep adopting the same plan over and over. That 10-year span is really important to get to some of the slower actions that happen on the regional and municipal level. And if that's not this conversation, that's okay. I hope we have it at some point, maybe not in this group or in this framework, but the state plan, maybe it's clear why it's 5 years. Maybe it is clear who it is serving. We just didn't get it till we got here. We're like, oh, light bulbs.
All right, Chip.
Thank you. So I really think this needs to be the executive branch plan. I think the legislature should ratify it. I think the timeline needs to be out to 20 years. Things like affordable housing, you can't build a couple 100,000 units in 3 or 5 years. It's not the term of a governor. It's certainly not the term of a legislative committee leader. So I think we need to think in terms of a much longer time frame with, like Ed has talked about, you could chunk it to increments or modifications or check off and say, we've accomplished 80% of our goals, and that's a less important thing because we've got things in the pipeline. But I think it's important that OPM handles it because people like you, Rebecca, will be there for far longer than any of the politicians will be there. And I think that gives the state consistency because it's not the legislature's plan or the governor's plan. It's the plan for the state of Connecticut, for the 3.5 million people that live here and what their collective goals and aspirations are. We're the mere representatives of them.
Okay, thank you, Chip. So just in the interest of time, I think we've been touching on pretty much all of the questions really, but I'd like to kind of jump to, if we are talking about a more visionary and goals-based plan to guide state actions, how should it be implemented? Is there, any thought to a change in process there? Anyone? Go ahead, John Board. Sorry, go ahead, John Board.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm looking here right now. It says $200,000 or greater. Is that what's currently in statute, or is that what is adjusted for inflation?
That's what's in statute. There's kind of a two-pronged approach here. There's consistency with the plan, and then there's also the priority funding areas. And it's actions that are of, affecting property that cost $200,000 or more that trigger those.
So is there a way that, and obviously I'm going to say, is there a way, but I'm sure there is a way, but is there a way to not tie that to a dollar amount, but tie that to a formula? So then depending on, how the economy is, that rather than having a specific dollar amount, I think that might be helpful to provide some flexibility there.
Okay.
The other thing that I would have is the review. I think we should have some review if we go along with Chip's recommendation of 20 years. I think maybe 15 years might be something, and then have either COG or legislative review or check in sort of at the 5-year mark, just to sort of see how things are progressing, might be helpful as well. Those are my 2 thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks. Chip?
Yeah, I was just going to say, isn't the only state input financial, that either the state is providing money to towns or regions for projects, or they're doing them themselves? So I think that we just have to have alignment with the budgetary priorities and what the plan of conservation is for priorities. And I think that settles most of the questions.
Okay. John Guskowski?
So Representative McCarthy-Vahey would know the process better than I would, but it's my understanding that the governor basically prepares a budget, OPM prepares a budget, and then works with the legislature to get it passed, right? So I think in that process, I don't know if there's a requirement that there be some finding or statement of budgetary line items or departmental budgets that reflect back on the plan of conservation and development. But I think that would be a helpful step or a helpful process when the governor's office, which is to say OPM, proposes a state budget and breaks it down either by department or by key initiative and say, this is how we are advancing the POCD.
Okay. Rachel?
Maybe I don't understand the question now, suddenly, now that I'm listening to everyone else. So I thought how should be implemented. I mean, for me, it should be so as you get the priorities down, right? The plan comes back with how, whether it be I'll just take the local, right? The municipalities first, how they plan to implement it, what their needs are. So let's say budget, or if there's any exceptions, or anything from the regional cogs, right? Because it covers something on a regional basis, right? It's one town to the next, right? So it's how they plan to meet it, if there's an exception, if there's budget, right? So it kind of sends back the plan and outlines it, and then outlines incrementally year over year what they plan to do. So it lays out their metrics. I mean, that's what I envision. And then updates go out annually or semi-annually. I totally agree. It shouldn't be, a new plan every year or every 5 years. Totally get that. But I think there should be some, some updates, maybe it's every 2 years or something, on how they're hitting, their goals. But I do think that in that response back in the plan, there needs to be an understanding of what's needed from a budgetary perspective. And if they don't get it from the state, what are the risks associated with meeting the plan then, right? Because there's going to be risks. If you don't get the budget, there's going to be risks. And if they don't get the support on a regional basis, let's say, again, something's needed from a regional basis, or there's an exception needed from a legislative basis, what are the risks? So I think the plan needs to be robust enough to show all that. And then they implement. That's what I would say from how does it get implemented? And then move forward.
Okay, Lynn?
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what's been said so far, that it needs to be tied to the budget. I view this plan as we've said, that guiding framework. And so then each department should be laying out its action plan or its strategies, all based off of achieving the goals and objectives that are set out in the plan. So, yes, there should be metrics in the plan to be achieved, even if they're kind of general. But then those departments are the ones who ultimately implement it by showing through their budget and action plans how they're implementing it. I mean, we do it here in Bridgeport, where every time we go to the council to ask for money or to get a project approved, we're saying we are implementing XYZ out of our POCD. So that they see that everything we're doing is tied back in to our POCD, and that's how the state could function as well.
Okay, So I'm cognizant of the time. I like to keep going if you all can stick around for another few minutes. SN.
Thanks, Rebecca. So when I think of implementation, and I hope this doesn't seem too far off because I feel it is connected. I can only speak the scales I know. So if there's, to kind of Lynn's point, but then I'm going somewhere else a little bit. If there's a text amendment to a zoning regulation, a planning commission has to make a finding if they're different bodies that it's consistent with the plan of conservation and development. On the municipal to regional level, anytime a municipality is updating their POCD, it has to get reviewed by the COG through a referral to show if it's consistent with the regional and state plans. On the local level, if the planning commission makes a determination that it's not consistent with the plan of conservation and development, it forces a supermajority of the zoning commission when they're acting. And so if there's a way that we could take, and I don't like carrots and sticks, but that's how we know it. But like if we don't want to tie the stick to budget, like can we tie it to the decision-making process somehow? Like, is that another way we can strengthen that implementation mechanism? And I hope that analogy gets where it needs to go.
Yeah, I think that was clear. Kevin?
I think I will take a minute to try to understand that analogy, but I do understand what you're talking about. I think a significant part of this, like the 5 years or the 10 years or whenever this is going back before the legislature, that the report or the plan should always include, all right, here are the goals that we set out last time. These are the metrics that we laid out that relate to those goals. Here's the specific progress we have made towards them. And for those that we have not made progress, what has hindered that progress, so that the legislature has an understanding of what actions they can or should consider at least taking to try to correct for that. Is it a challenge of we don't have a funding stream available to be able to fund X, Y, or Z project? Is it a problem of land use? Is it whatever those challenges are? And then another section that is the new goals. What for these next 5 years did we not consider last time, but the changing circumstances of our state now demands more of us? So I think a significant part of this, and I know that the implementation side, I think what Lynn said was absolutely right, of these departments having to very clearly state, all right, this is what we're doing to try to meet these goals, but that a component of it should be evaluating what's standing in the way from us getting there and how do we correct for that. And that's where the legislature will ultimately make the determinations of where to put what where, but after the recommendations from the executive branch based off of those metrics and that information.
Okay, thank you. John Board?
Yes. First of all, Kevin, I echo what you're saying 100% there. And I think that goes back to Lynn as well. I want to kind of play devil's advocate here with what SN was saying, in the sense of not that I disagree with you, SN, but do you think that there's a potential risk in terms of tying it to the budget, in terms of how the legislature and how appropriations committee may decide to fund certain things, even if we ensure that there's the justification in there? Obviously, there's only so much money to go around in the state budget. Is there a risk in tying it to budget, and is there a way that we can, I guess, try to put this on autopilot through formulas and preferences as much as we can, to try to take the politics out of this decision-making process as much as possible? If hopefully what I said landed with people, maybe.
So, I mean, I think we've been hearing that if we think of this as a goals-based sort of plan that's setting the objectives for agencies, what I've been hearing is that agencies should then be doing their budgeting and their annual action plans, or however they operate, with that in mind, with those goals and objectives in mind. And I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads right now. Does that? And so I see the legislature ultimately approves the budget, but if agencies and OPM are recommending their budget and they're doing it with the C&D plan top of mind, then I think that is trying to remove the politics from it.
Okay, so
I was more concerned on the legislative sides in terms of politics driving how certain aspects of the plan may be how those funds may be appropriated, given which municipalities and cogs are positioned depending on what representatives, et cetera, trying to make it as nonpartisan as we can. Sorry, Rachel.
No, I was looking to raise my hand. I'm like, I'm gonna raise my hand.
Yeah.
So can I say one thing on that? So when you submit your budget, right? So Rebecca, I was following you, and then you submit your budgets, right? And to your point, John, I think this is what you're saying is there's never enough money for everyone to get what they ask for. So how then do you make the decision on who gets what? And so I think I was following you saying, how is there a formula? Is there a way? Who has the most need versus it becoming a political thing of who's got the biggest voice or who, is that what you were saying? Because I was totally if that's what you were saying, I was following you.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. And I'm trying to figure out from an implementation standpoint, what agency or group is the best to be nonpartisan in that. That makes sense.
To look across all the asks when the budgets come in and say, okay, here's all the asks. Everyone wants something. We don't have enough to pay for everyone. Who has the most need? Who are we going to give the money to for this year or this whatever? Totally agree. Thank you.
See you 100%. Yes.
I'm there with you too. Thanks.
Go ahead, Kevin.
My only sort of aside to that, or kind of contrasting that, I do think politics is somewhat important in this, in that the legislative branch is elected to represent people. It's the one sort of entity in this process where you want it to be responsive to the interests of the people that this document is governing. You want to inform to the highest extent it can be by as much factual information as we have. That's where the executive branch is the appropriate agency to say, hey, this is what the factual information is. These are our recommendations. And then the legislative branch should be the one to say, okay, yeah, we're going to follow what their recommendations are, or no, we're not, because we think this is actually better because this is what people elected us to do. So I think that dynamic is important in this. So in the conversation of like, what is the state? They're both the state. They're both have to have that relationship and that dynamic.
Go ahead, Representative McCarthy.
Thank you. And Rebecca, in the interest of time, I know this is a very robust conversation and actually very important. Today, I think it's brought, and Rebecca, thank you for providing the framework for us to bring a lot of the pieces together. I know that there were folks that were involved in the process earlier on, and I really hope if any of you are in touch with them, that maybe you can invite them to come back, because I think this is helping draw together some of those strands that were out there. It certainly is raising more questions, right? Which maybe makes it a little messier for us, but that's part of why the legislature decided to expand this another year. Because, and I was, I'll just say that, yes, the comments and the questions around the regional and state plans and the timelines and the way we do budgeting, these are actually very big, significant issues and conversations, which are going to take some time. So I think right now we need to move on to the final two very quick items on our agenda. And I just want to say thank you to Rebecca. And I know others are nodding their heads and saying the same. Next steps, as you can see, we've turned to quite a reliance, as we always do, on OPM, and with Rebecca's leadership, we'll continue to kind of refine and look for next steps in the conversation. There will be, as there have been, by the way, conversations that are happening in between time and meetings to try and bring some of these pieces together to make it easier for us as a group to have these conversations. The next two meetings scheduled are October 27th and November 10th from 4 to 5. We may find that we might need to expand that hour a little bit past. So I'm just going to suggest that people can hold 90 minutes in their schedules for those time periods. I just have to double check that the Zoom time of the Zoom and the YouTube channel is available during those time frames, particularly because we are being asked to submit any recommendations for the next legislative session to be discussed at the full meeting of the body that we're all, working as part of our working group under for that December 5th meeting. So just kind of keeping that in mind. The last thing I'll say is that as you think about this conversation, if you have other ideas, things that have occurred to you, whatever it may be, you can certainly reach out to via Ashley. You have her contact info, to me or to Rebecca. I know you have, I think everyone has our email, and share those thoughts. And Rebecca, I'll give you one final chance to comment before we adjourn.
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation today, and I do hope that we can frame the next meeting's conversation in a similar fashion to just guide us to really getting to the meat of the matters.
Yep, wonderful. Well, thank you all very much for taking the time to be here today with us. The dates, our November date again is November 10th, and their October date before that is October 27th. Those are the next two meetings. We've essentially been doing every other week with another working group that's at the same time frame as we are. So I don't know though, if I haven't looked at the November schedule, we may be running into Thanksgiving. That's exactly right. Yes, if we did every other week, the second meeting in November would be Thanksgiving. So we will need to adjust, and we're going to have to get back to you on that one. All right, with that, we are adjourned. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a good one.
you.